G'day everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to discuss our preparedness for the risk of spotted wing Drosophila. It's been really great to see the level of interest we've received in this webinar topic, and the number of people who are able to join us in this discussion on this threat to Australian production of strawberries and other horticulture fruit. My name is Clinton Muller. I work with RM Consulting Group. We coordinate the National Strawberry Research and Development Extension Program, Strawberry Innovation, which is funded by the Strawberry Levy, funded with co-contribution from the Australian Government through Port Innovation. We're very fortunate to be joined by an impressive array of speakers involved in the Hort Innovation-funded Spotted Wing Drosophila Preparedness Project to share some lessons from overseas and also outline the risks to the Australian industry. On the line, all the virtual way from the East Malling Research Centre in the UK, we have Bethan Shaw. We've also got James Maino from Cesar and Central Coast New South Wales grower and Chair of Protected Cropping Australia, Nicky Mann. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping for those who have not joined a webinar before. They're not scary, relax, they're all a bit of fun. But this 1 hour discussion is being recorded and we'll make it available on the Strawberry Innovation website so you can watch again or share with those who could not join the session with us live. For those who are joining us live, I do encourage you to participate and really welcome your questions. If you do have a burning question at any stage of any of the speakers, please feel welcome to type the question down during their talk and I'll put it to them. We'll also have some time for Q&A discussion at the end where I'll save up any of those questions. How to ask the question is a really easy process. Just type it into the question tab on your GoToWebinar toolbar that should have popped up on your screen. You can also find some useful handouts relevant to the project and download them from the toolbar. As we've got a very full packed program for this session, I'm going to jump straight into it and invite Dr. Jessica Lai from Cesar. Jessica's going to provide us with a brief overview of the Spotted Wing Drosophila Preparedness Project. And I'm just going to pass on to her now, just give us that overview. Cheers, Jess.
Thanks a lot, Clinton. So we're just bringing up our screen now. So I would just like to give everybody an overview of the project just to contextualise where this webinar sits. It sits within a series of outreach activities that we're doing around spotted wing Drosophila. This project was launched in about halfway through last year and it's running for 2 years. And our research partners are Plant Health Australia, who is leading the project, Plant and Food Research New Zealand, and Port Innovation, providing funding through several industry levies, the Strawberry Levy, Rubus, Cherry and Summer Fruit levies. We also have some support from Horticulture New Zealand. So this is a great project. We're collaborating very strongly with New Zealand, which means that we are creating efficiencies in the work that we're doing and we're sharing information. Since New Zealand do not yet have spotted wing Drosophila either. So the project was really launched in recognition of spotted wing Drosophila being a species that has the potential to have a high economic damage to affected industries in Australia. And in other countries around the world, it has been spreading over the last few years and they're now learning how to manage this pest. So in some ways, we're fortunate because we don't yet have spotted wing Drosophila, and hopefully we never do have it, but we're in a position where we can have a look at what other countries are doing to control and manage this pest and assess what works for them and what hasn't worked so well. So what is the project comprised of? We're doing a bit of research, desktop research, looking at how the pest might potentially establish and spread throughout Australia. And really, the main aims of the project by the end of the 2 years are to increase the chance of reporting from growers, community, and biosecurity officers. So making sure people know what to look for and damage symptoms. And also to improve our capacity as a country to make sure if we do get spotted wing Drosophila, we can respond quickly, effectively, and we know what control options are available to us. So the first component of the project is looking at entry pathways. So what are the pathways by which spotted wing Drosophila are likely to come into the country? And also, what are the industries that are going to be highly affected by an incursion of spotted wing Drosophila? We're also looking at management practices And also we're looking at how industries overseas have effectively managed this pest. So we're doing a lot of desktop literature reviews, compiling all of that information, and that will aid us in developing data sets to get emergency permits placed on the shelf in preparedness for if we do get spotted wing Drosophila in the country. All of this information will be compiled into a contingency plan that we can keep ready if we do have an incursion that will help us either eradicate the pest or contain it or move into effective management as quickly as possible. And the plan will include information on best ways to survey spotted wing Drosophila. So the last part of the project involves outreach. We do have a communication and awareness program for spotted wing Drosophila that's comprised of updates on the research that we're doing and also some events. So we held a preparedness workshop late last year. We gathered together professionals from government and industry to talk about, under different scenarios, how would you best respond to an incursion of spotted wing Drosophila. So you can see a picture there. We're doing some scenario analysis, and at this event we were looking at what are the pathways that we would need to pay attention to that might allow spotted wing to be transmitted into the country. How would you manage an early first detection, so early stages of an incursion? How would you manage market access issues? What are the best management practices overseas? And how would you make sure that best management practices are adopted by industry? We also did a roadshow late last year, and we were lucky to get Professor Rufus Isaacs from Michigan University over, as well as Dr. Bethan Shaw, who is joining us tonight. So that's great that Bethan has come back to extend her knowledge again. And we visited Launceston, Tassie, Caboolture in Queensland, Yarra Valley in Victoria, and Coffs Harbour in New South Wales. So that was a roadshow that we undertook to raise awareness about spotted wing, how do you identify, and best management practices. So if you'd like more project information, you can have a look at the CESAR website at cesaraustralia.com/our projects. And if you would like to receive regular updates from the project, you can email us and ask us to join the project database for regular updates. So with that, I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thanks, Clinton.
Excellent. Look, thanks for that, Jess. That's great. And just a reminder, some of those key handouts in relation to the project are available through the handouts bar on the webinar. So I would encourage you, if you are interested at all, just to jump on there and download those handouts, as well as accessing via the CESAR website. So I'm just going to invite Bethan all the way from the UK just to share some experience with us on the biology and also the best management practices approach from some of those shared lessons from the UK and related to this pest. Cheers, Bethan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me this morning. I am based at NIAB EMR, which is in the southeast of England. And it was in 2012 that we first detected SWD in the UK, and that was on site here. I've been asked to talk a little bit today about the biology of SWD and also some of the best management practices that are being used to tackle it. I'm more than happy for people to drop me emails at a later date, and my email address will be popping up at the end if you want to jot it down. So I just thought I'd touch very briefly on a bit of identification. They are SWD look very similar to most common Drosophila species. They're between 2 and 3 millimeters in length, and they are this really nice light brown colour. The males are much easier to identify. They have this really lovely black spot on each of the wingtips, and they also have these 2 black sex combs on the front legs, which are used during mating. Now, in the UK, there are no other species that meet these characteristics, so it's really easy for us to identify the males in our traps. The females are slightly harder to identify, and the only thing that really sets them apart from other species is this really severe ovipositor. And in the picture that you can see on your screen at the moment, there's an egg protruding from this female. The drawing on the right-hand side is a bit more of an in-depth, detailed image, but it is worth saying that the photographed on the left is more likely what you're going to see in a trap catch. And if you do compare that ovipositor with other common Drosophila species, you will see the severe differences between them. The reason that this pest is such a problem is because the female uses this ovipositor to cut into the skin of ripening fruits. So this is fruit that's still on the cane or on the bush and still growing. Once it's cut into the fruit, it lays an egg beneath the fruit surface, and you can see these breathing filaments on your screen at the moment. So it actually makes it really difficult to see a new infestation of SWD. And these breathing filaments almost act like a snorkel for the egg within the fruit so it can respire. Just to talk a little bit about the life cycle, the speed in which it goes through the life cycle varies with temperature, but the example I've got here is just at 23 degrees. So after the egg has been laid, it hatches within 12 to 24 hours, and then it goes through 3 larval instars. And during that time, the larvae feed on the fruit flesh within the fruit itself, and that's what causes the collapse of the fruit structure. After this time, the larvae either leaves the fruit to pupate or it pupates within the fruit itself. And about 14 days after the egg has been laid, you get the first emergence of the adults. These adults can live between 20 to 30 days, and a female can lay between 200 and 300 eggs in her lifetime. In colder climates, we also have a winter morph of this fly, which occurs when pupation is happening below 10 degrees. And we actually get a much bigger, darker fly emerge from the pupal case. And this overwintering morph can last for over 100 days and can survive really cold temperatures. But luckily, those winter morph flies don't, they go through a reproductive diapause. So the females don't lay eggs during this time. They wait until the warmer weather to lay their eggs. The problem that we have is there's only 2 points in this life cycle that actually occur outside of the fruit. Excuse me. So a lot of our protection products are used to try and reduce adult numbers themselves or prevent egg laying. Because once the egg and the larvae are within that fruit, it's really difficult to try and control the numbers. The damage that we find, typically this image on the left-hand side, it's a slight collapsing of the fruit, and this occurs about 2 to 3 days after the egg laying has occurred from the larvae feeding under the surface of the skin. In really severe damage, we can actually find it looks like the fruit is melting from the crop. And I do have to stress that this image is taken from a strategic orchard where we do a lot of our research. So there was no preventative or curative methods being applied. But just to give you an example of what can happen if nothing is done. Just to talk a little bit about oviposition behaviour, the problem we have with this is the patterns in oviposition change with environmental conditions, but there are a few rules that they seem to apply. Optimum temperature for egg laying, survival and development is between 18 and 26 degrees. The females will not lay eggs below 10 degrees and above 30 degrees. And that's because they perform a kind of brood care for their offspring. They won't lay their eggs in unfavourable conditions, so they'll retain them until the weather either warms up or cools down. So in temperate climates, we have diurnal egg laying, and our peak egg laying appears to occur in the warmest parts of the day, like I say, as long as they don't exceed 30 degrees. But in much warmer climates, egg laying can be pushed to being nocturnal, or it can occur in the dusk and dawn periods of the day. They really need high humidity, anything above 60%. And the females also don't like laying eggs in direct sunlight, so they prefer the shady areas of the canopy to deposit their eggs. So now I'm just going to talk about a bit of detecting SWD and then some of the IPM strategies that are being used to target it. So trapping the adults, although we use it for monitoring, it does also work as an IPM strategy because it does hoover up some of the flying adults in our cropping situations. And these monitoring traps are deployed in both cropping and wild areas because we know that they overwinter in woodlands and hedgerows. And there's a lot of traps that are available commercially, but there are also a lot of traps that can be made just from like a 2 litre pop bottle. And these traps are filled with an attractant which is based on fermenting fruit volatiles, because although the females are ovipositing in ripening fruit, they still are attracted to decomposing and fermenting fruit for feeding. And again, there are a lot of commercially available attractants, but then there's also a lot of homemade recipes that can be used. So in the southeast of England, this is the trap catchers that we've had since we began our monitoring programme in 2013. So as I said, we detected the pest in 2012, and it wasn't until after the pest arrived that we actually received funding to do any work on it. So these trap catchers are on a log scale. So in 2013, you can see from October to November, our mean trap catch was only up to 5. It's then rapidly increased year on year, although now we do seem to have settled down a little bit. What you may notice is that our highest trap catches occur in the autumn, and this is because the populations have been building over the summer periods. We also find that when we have fruit present in our cropping situations, our trap catches are much lower. So once the fruit has all vanished in the autumn and in the winter, our trap catches increase because there's no competition with the fruit. We can also monitor for SWD in the fruit itself, and this is looking for the eggs and larvae. The larval extraction is the quickest method, and this is where you submerge fruit in a salt or sugar solution, and it draws the larvae out of the fruit, so you can see them wiggling through the solution. This obviously doesn't identify the larvae to species, but the rule that we use is if you've picked ripening fruit, there's no other species it could be. The adult emergence is a much longer process. It's where you hold a sample of fruit in a ventilated box for up to 2 weeks, and then you identify the flies that emerge from it. And like I said, this does take a lot longer, but then you have a definite answer of whether or not it is SWD in the fruit. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the IPM strategies that are being used. The first one is crop management, and I always think this is the simplest method, although it can be quite labour intensive. So the first point is looking at removing excess canopy from a crop, and this increases the light that gets into the canopy of the crop. And as I said, SWD females prefer shaded areas for laying eggs, so if you can increase the light, we can deter egg laying slightly. It also means that if you do have to apply a plant protection product, that spray penetration is much more effective and you get a better coverage of the fruit. It also means that you reduce the chance of fruit being missed at picking, which I'll come on to a little bit later on. The condition of matting that is underneath the crop, or the mypex that's on the floor of the tunnel, as I say, sometimes the larvae exit the fruit to pupate, and if your matting is in really good condition, there's more chance of the larvae desiccating, and we actually know that successive pupation outside the fruit is reduced if the matting is in good condition. And monitoring irrigation, making sure that there's no puddles or pools of water that are occurring underneath the irrigation lines, because this is removing a water source for the adults. But what we also find is that all 3 of these points reduce humidity, and as I say, humidity is key for this pest. We know that in much warmer areas where they have low humidity, they don't suffer so much with SWD as those that do have high humidity. So all these points are looking at trying to reduce the humidity in the crop itself. Going on to type picking, this is a piece of work that Rufus Isaac's group has published, but the concept is quite simple. It's just increasing the picking schedule. So picking every 2 days has been found to significantly reduce the occurrence of fruit damage. Not only picking commercial fruit, but also picking non-marketable fruits and misshapes and damages as well. Not only picking commercial fruit, but also picking waste fruit rapidly as well helps. The problem that we have is that pickers used to go through our crops and leave fruit that was unmarketable on the canes or on the plants or on the bushes. And this could actually be providing another inoculation source, because it could be that that damage has been caused by SWD. And by not removing it from the crop, you're just letting the next generations emerge. Also, because SWD are feeding on decomposing fruit, you're actually leaving a feeding site in there, which is we want to kind of reduce. So what we have here in the picture on the right hand side is our pickers go through and pick off all the commercial fruit, and then they go through with a waste bucket and pick any fruit that's not going to be sold commercially. That fruit then has to be disposed of. So there's a method that has been devised in which we put all that waste and unmarketable fruit into sealable pallet bins and seal them for up to 3 days in ambient air temperatures of up to 20 degrees. And this causes a buildup of CO2, which kills all the eggs and larvae that it was in the fruit. Now, for stone fruit, we have to do this for a little bit longer because there are pockets of air around the stones in cherries and plums. So this can take up to 2 weeks. Once the fruit has been sterilised, it is still attractive and can still be used as a oviposition and feeding site. So it then needs to be disposed of properly. And there's a few methods for this. One of them is applying the waste onto bare soil and then tilling it in, making sure that it's incorporated. Some people send it off to silage or for animal feeds. We have a grower as well that sends it to a local pig farmer. Now, netting is more of a physical barrier to prevent the flies from entering a cropping situation, and this is used really heavily in Europe, particularly on wine grapes. The problem that we have with netting is timing is really key, because we don't want to be putting the netting on before pollination has occurred, but we also need to be putting it on before the flies have moved into the crop. Obviously, if you're provisioning crops with bumblebees, then this isn't a problem. But we say no later than applying the net before white fruit, no later than white fruit for applying the nets. And the graph you can see is just the trap catchers from a project that we did last summer, where the dash line is the trap catchers from inside the netted area, and the black line is outside the netted area. And again, Rufus's group has done some fantastic work that is published. So if you want a little bit more information about size, I would have a look at that paper. So the next thing is something that our growers really like, and that's free biocontrol. So there was a lovely piece of work done looking at analysing the gut content of naturally occurring generalist predators in cropping situations. And what they did was they looked at the DNA content of these insects and found that most of them contained SWD DNA. So this is free predation that is occurring naturally. We're also looking for generalist parasitoids to target the eggs and the larvae and the pupal stages of this pest. So we've been surveying the naturally occurring parasitoids that we have in the UK. And so far we found 4 species that are actively parasitising SWD. One is on for SWD specific parasitoids, and there are groups that are trying to get registration for introducing parasitoids that are from this pest's native region. So they'll be much more species specific and hopefully have a higher impact rate. With parasitoids and the predators, though, it's really worthwhile bearing in mind that these use natural habitats as a reservoir. That's where they are breeding and spending most of their time. They're not found in the wild. They're not found in the cropping situations, and that's because they're really sensitive to plant protection products. So we do always encourage growers to leave the wild habitats surrounding cropping situations as a refuge for these wild parasitoids and predators. Also in the natural habitats, we find there's a lot of dead-end hosts. So these are fruiting plants, some of them may be ornamental. These are fruiting plants that SWD will lay eggs in, but then those larvae and the eggs don't develop through to adult emergence. So what we're looking for is a highly attractive fruit with a low development score. So on the graph here, it's the green shaded areas. So we also bear this in mind when we're looking at the habitat surrounding our cropping situations to see whether or not there's any of these dead-end hosts present. That was a real whistle-stop tour on IPM for SWD because you could talk about it for hours. But the thing we always try and keep in mind is that IPM for this pest is going to consist of lots of different approaches to target all life stages of the pest all year round. And also, it's really worth mentioning that you can't do it on your own. We need a lot of involvement from industry and from research bodies. So that's the end of my session. My email address is on there, along with Michelle Fountains, who is the head of entomology at NIAB EMR. I've also included the AHDB website, which is how we disseminate all our SWD updates to growers. So if you have any other questions, or if you want to look into that into a bit more detail, then please feel free to contact those. And thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Bethan. That was a really fantastic overview in a short 20 minutes. A couple of questions have come through just as we're getting geared up for James. I just might fire these questions that have come through. Bron and Cole from the Yarra Valley. Just wanted to clarify if there's a preference for spotted wing Drosophila egg laying on the fruit and whether that's on the underside.
Yes, so when they're laying their eggs, they do, because they don't like this direct sunlight, they will go for the shaded areas, which quite often means that they will lay on the underside of the fruit, yeah. But it's more a shade thing than they prefer laying underneath, if that makes sense.
Excellent. And just the other question was in relation to some of the waste control measures you referenced. How do you measure the carbon dioxide levels to know if it's safe to release the waste fruit?
So we did replicated studies on it and have shown that in 3 days, when temperatures are between 12 and 20 degrees, the CO2 ramps up enough for it to kill everything. So the rule that we use with our growers is monitoring the temperature and making sure that it is sealable, a sealable container. We did have to put pressure relief valves on the container lids because there were incidences of them kind of blowing up. So it is worth bearing that in mind. But we would suggest, as long as we've done it for a minimum of 3 days and the temperatures are above 12 degrees, then it should be fine. You can buy monitor probes, which is how we registered the CO2 in our experiments. But growers don't have to go to that length because the work has already been done, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Look, you really appreciate it, Bethan. Just to remind everyone, if you do have any questions at all, feel free just to type them away and we'll get to them at the end. But I'm going to pass over to James from Cesar. I think James has got a really exciting presentation that's very relevant and targeted, just to show some of the great work that's been undertaken through this project. So all yours, James.
Thanks, Clinton. And I think just thanks to Bethan, I think it's a fantastic example of the lucky position that we are in Australia to really leverage this great international work that has been done over the last few years on Drosophila suzukii as it has emerged as a pest of global significance. So my talk today is basically going to look at giving it a bit more of an Australian context. Particularly looking at areas that's most likely to establish and spread and the industries that it's going to potentially impact if that were to ever happen. And to provide a little bit of context, biosecurity sort of incursion can be broken down into 3 key steps. There's the arrival of the pest itself, and that in itself doesn't necessarily lead to establishment. That population then needs to become established. And just because it gets established in a particular area doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to instantly spread everywhere. So you can basically break it down into those 3 steps. This first step is where international quarantine and biosecurity plays a very important role. And these second 2 steps is where industry preparedness really comes into it, which involves both knowing what can be done to manage the pest, but also surveillance practices and domestic biosecurity. So I'm going to first talk about establishment risks in this, and this is largely emerged out of some risk modelling work that I've conducted. Going back to the point that Bethan made about optimum temperatures for Drosophila suzukii, here is another way of looking at it. If we've got population growth rates on the vertical axes and temperature on the x-axis, you see that positive population growth rates are constrained to that pretty much within that 10 to 30 degree range. But there's quite a lot of variation among that, but that's sort of the general pattern there. So what we can do is we can take that pattern, we can combine it with other stressful processes such as cold mortality, heat mortality, desiccation, or when things get too dry, put that into a model, combine that with international data sets on climate, and basically project what we think the population growth rate is likely to be across the entire globe. We can validate that prediction against the distribution of Drosophila suzukii internationally, and we find that the model does capture a lot of the locations where it is found currently, which are the black dots on this map, as well as a bunch of other locations where it is not yet found, but is predicted to be highly suitable. And as you'll see, one of those places is Australia. So if we zoom into Australia, it's not very pretty because there are a lot of key growing areas there that seem to be supporting positive growth rates when averaged across the year. And now this is the analysis that I've conducted, but other sort of approaches that look at just more abstract risk indices also seem to find that there are quite a large number of susceptible or acceptable locations in Australia for Drosophila suzukii. So here is one study done by Dos Santos et al. In 2017. One model that they fit. Another model that they fit also showed a wide sort of potential distribution in Australia. And a more recent study by Orsted et al. In 2019 finds a similar finding. So taken together, these studies show that there are potentially a lot of areas in Australia that are going to be suitable for Drosophila suzukii. So it's definitely something that we need to keep an eye out for, particularly when we look at the location of some of our key growing areas of affected commodities. So typically soft fruits here, so blueberries, cherries, strawberries, grapes, stone fruit. Many of these key locations for these growing regions are found in areas that are going to be quite acceptable for Drosophila suzukii to persist, particularly those more coastal regions. If we look at strawberries, this is particularly true. Perhaps you could argue that grapes, at least table grapes, may be a little more safe being further inland. But strawberries in particular seem to be at risk in terms of the suitability of the climates that these key growing regions occur in. So I should have mentioned that this is Australian Bureau of Statistics data on commodity production, which has enabled me to plot the sort of key growing regions. I've also compiled sort of international data on reports of crop loss so that we can get some sense of what the expected sort of unmitigated damages are going to be for different crops. And already some interesting findings have emerged. This is really hot off the press analysis that I've conducted based on this literature review. But what we find down the bottom is that strawberries, perhaps of all of the affected commodities, the reported crop losses tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum. Of course, you get some cases where a very, very high crop loss, above 70%, but those incidences are comparatively rare. And the other important thing to mention is that a lot of these are unmitigated crop losses as well. So this is not implementing, in all cases, the management practices that Bethan was talking about earlier. So this really sort of hits home why it's so important to implement those management practices and really know the pests that we're dealing with. So in terms of spread risk, this is when this is looking at the international literature again and looking at whether or not we can see patterns in the way that it is spread overseas. Again, learning from that international experience. Here is the spread pattern in the United States. Lighter regions where it colonized first in California and Florida and darker regions later. Similar plot for Europe, and pretty much the take home from these plots is within a decade it had almost spread across the entire continent. So we can use this data to learn from. We can use it to validate models of spread for suzukii, and this is exactly what we've done. So here in the yellow, you can see the state level presences of Drosophila suzukii through time over 6 years, and the black is the kind of model prediction which we have developed, which explains about 80% of the variation in the establishment rates, which is quite impressive given that it's largely considered a stochastic process. What I think is even more impressive is if you take the same model and you just apply it to Europe, you're able to explain similar levels of variance there. So around 75% of the presences and absences at the country level. So it's important to point out that it's a simple model that's just based on population growth rates that I talked about earlier, derived from that curve that I showed you, as well as short range jumps that you can see the little circles expanding, as well as longer distance jumps that are human mediated, because we know these days human mediated transport of pests is extremely important in biosecurity. But more importantly, what this allows us to do is look at Australia and have a bit more confidence when we apply these spread scenarios that they're actually going to be somewhat realistic. If we can explain the data in the US and the data in Europe, this gives us some sense of what spread might look like at an incursion in Australia. So here's a simulated incursion in Brisbane over 6 years, and you can see, just like in the plots in Europe and the US, it is an extremely fast spread across the entire eastern coast of Australia. And we can run that simulation for an outbreak in Launceston, and spread is a little bit slower, but you can still see that by the end of 6 years, it has managed to spread quite rapidly over this, the eastern coast. So it is a stochastic process, and we can run this simulation multiple times and look for patterns. But unfortunately, what we're sort of seeing at this early stage is that doesn't matter where you really started from on the eastern coast, whether it's Cairns, Brisbane, Melbourne, or Adelaide, it very quickly fills that ecological niche on the eastern side, and sometimes even makes it across to WA. So not great news if it does make it to Australia. So just to wrap up, coming back to the introduction slide, really this arrival, establishment, and spread process, like, you can really think about management as affecting each one of those components in the puzzle. But what I've talked about today has really been around establishment and spread, and a lot of this stuff is going to go into the contingency plan that is being developed as a part of this project. We're less than a year into this project, and I think we've managed to accomplish a bit to date, but hopefully we're going to continue this trajectory and really develop some useful outputs for industry. A lot of this stuff can also be found at our CESAR website, and I think if I had to come up with one take home, it's really that we want to be really focused on being prepared for this pest if it ever does get here, because that will allow us to mitigate a lot of the losses that we see by proper identification of the pest, and also really knowing what these management practices are beforehand, so that we don't have to suffer the losses first before we learn our lessons. There's huge international learnings to take on board that we really need to make the most of. And I'll end it there. And thank you, partners. Can't hear you, Clinton.
There you go. I was so organised, I muted myself, but I'm unmuted now. Thanks for that, James. Really appreciate it. Just a question's come in from Aileen Reid over in the Western Australian industry. Just wanted to get maybe some comments from yourself in regards to the variability in some of those earlier models you showed about the risk of spread. She just picked up some of those models show growth rates in Australia as being quite high, while others reasonably low. So I'm not sure if you've got any comments you'd like to share on those 3 different models.
Yeah, I think they all detected that the establishment risk was quite high for particularly the southeastern sort of coastal areas. I think there was greater variation in the sort of edges of that distribution, but I think that there's fairly unanimous agreement that that southeastern region of Australia is going to be quite suitable. Why is there variation in the first place? A lot of different reasons why, different methodologies that have been used. So I used a very sort of process-based mechanistic approach that looks at sort of the underlying population biology, whereas others are a bit more of a statistical approach. So they kind of try and draw correlations between where things are seen, what other environmental conditions occur there, and they infer a population distribution that way. I don't want to go too much into the technical details, but there's different methodologies and different data underpinning those predictions. But I think fairly unanimous agreement across those different models that there are large areas of Australia suitable for the pest.
Fantastic. Look, really appreciate that, James. I might introduce Nicky Mann to take the floor and give a presentation. I think there's a nice segue too from James's comment about the importance of international experiences. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Nicky about some of her specialist experience in observing how other growers internationally have responded to this threat. So all yours, Nicky.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on. I did my Nuffield scholarship in 2014, and my study topic was intensive berry production using greenhouses, substrates, and hydroponics. And obviously, my travels took me around the world, and I was obviously looking at anyone who was growing berries intensively. And one of my findings from my research when I did my study was the spotted wing Drosophila. And you know, we coming from Australia, we sort of like quite used to the Queensland fruit fly. But what I did discover that this pest, you know, was causing absolute chaos. And when I was traveling around in 2014, you know, I just was surprised. And one of the things I did learn, like everyone else, you know, spotted wing Drosophila loves berries, and obviously berry growers don't love them. So one of the first experiences was I was in the Netherlands, and we went to the Blueberry Excellence Centre, and there was a trial plot there where they had yielded 7 kgs per plant in blueberries in a variety called Aurora in 2013. And in 2014, they did not yield a berry, which was sellable. So that was all due to the spotted wing Drosophila. So I sort of like sat up, and there we were talking about intensive production, and from putting things under greenhouse conditions or into substrates to intensify production, and the next thing, this pest comes along and all your investment has gone by the wayside. So that was my first first introduction to it, and obviously I've been under a stone up until then. And then the second one was I was at a conference, and I met a grower from Peru, and he had a 400-hectare farm where he grew blueberries, figs, pomegranates, asparagus, and he would hugely invested his money in getting market access and market share. And because the growers around him weren't taking the pests seriously, he bought all surrounding farms on his property to protect himself from SWD. So another, that was a huge investment, and he said he could only control his quarantine himself by buying surrounding farms. Everywhere I visited in Europe and in the States, there were these red fruit fly looking traps, which were quite remarkable because I'm always used to seeing yellow traps, and everyone was saying, oh no, this is for SWD. So all berry growers and soft fruit growers like cherries were all on high alert and seemed to be affected by SWD. And at that stage, I remember them saying, oh, there was still product coming into Europe from Chile, and Chile was very lucky at that stage because they hadn't been affected, because they were sort of like naturally quarantined by the Andes Mountains. And as you all probably know, it's SWD has managed to get over the Andes. So this is a couple of, this is what I was greeted at when I went to all these farms. A lot of the red traps, some of them makeshift, as Bethan mentioned, just the normal Coke bottles with, red electrical tape and little holes. Lots of red sticky traps. That was in, the sticky traps was in Sunshine Fruit in Portugal, protecting their raspberries. My husband and I had a meeting with the Anthony Pierce from Real IPM in the UK, and they'd come up with their own trap as well. As Bethan said, everyone was using some sort of attractant, and most people were using apple cider vinegar, the ones that I saw, or anything that was fermenting or would attract the SWD. This was actually in Ledbury at Haygrove. There was spotted wing Drosophila traps hanging in the trees and shrubbery surrounding the farms, and the IPM manager there, he said the first thing that they could do is they kept monitoring these traps before they would be watching these traps, so they could see if there was going to be incursion before they actually arrived in their greenhouses and attacked their strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, and blackberries, and their cherries. They had cherries as well. So this was a really good lesson for me, that people were going to great trouble to go into their woodlands and their hedgerows to put the traps out, because as Bethan was already explained, that's where they overwinter, and these are where farmers could make their first spottings of when they're going to have an incursion. People like Coppet came out quickly with fruit fly attractants. This obviously went through the market in 2014 when I was overseas. Everyone I seemed to visit seemed to have it. But, as farmers always do, they do tend to make their own concoctions and anything that would attract the SWD into the traps. As we've had explained, the big problem for most of the farmers is that with the SWD, because that lays eggs into fruit while it's ripening, and a lot of the time, there's no way that you can protect yourself from, because once they've been infected or the eggs have been injected into your fruit, you can't spray anything which will help you at all, because at that stage it's too late. And obviously with holding periods and stuff like that, anything that's going to destroy them is going to destroy your fruit or make it not edible. So that's why it made such devastating effect, because people were literally caught with discovering huge infestations of the larva once the crop was picked and in their cold rooms and ready to go for sale, and people just having to destroy things, fruit that had already been paid to be harvested or grown, and were having huge losses. Even in the States, this is what I did notice straight away, is that cultural patches changed, and it changed really quickly. In California, they were going through before, and as Bethan was highlighted to, a lot of people were leaving second grade or damaged or rotting fruit that they'd missed, leaving it on the bushes or leaving it to drop onto the floor. This changed severely. People were now sending employees down, doing a second harvest, picking up all the rotting or misshapen fruit, destroying it, putting it, taking it off the plant so that there wasn't attractants, and as they were rotting, they didn't, increase their, favorability to more incursions. So this was a huge change, and it costs a lot of money, but the cost of losing your entire crop is worse. So this was something that I noticed that was happening, especially in strawberries and raspberries as well. In New York State, the berry growers, most of them grow outdoors. They weren't in tunnels, but they were putting up these makeshift temporary insect netting over their blueberries, and it is a complicated process because you obviously need pollination. So by keeping out the SWD, you also sometimes keeping out your pollinators. So the physical barriers were really important, and it was quite encouraging for me doing a study on intensive production using greenhouses, tunnels, or hydroponics, because it is one of the advantages of protected cropping. I'm not saying it keeps all SWD out, but it definitely is a protectant, and gives you half a chance in some cases, so that you could actually then put in insect netting on your doors and entrances if needs be. So I won't go on too much. Now, you've obviously heard enough from the experts. Some good news, by 2016, when I travelled back with my husband when he was doing his Nuffield scholarship on IPM and intensive berry crops, the situation had vastly improved because everyone had stepped up their hygiene, their scouting protocols, coupled with extra vigilance. And obviously all the research institute like James Hutton, East Malling, were all doing a lot of work to help the farmers, get over this issue. And like everything, growers, I'm always impressed. We seem to be very resilient. We react, we adjust, and we just keep on going. But we need to be prepared for when this dreadful pest does reach our shores. And what does concern me as a grower, I do appreciate there's free markets and free trade, but sometimes when we are receiving products which are out of season here, when we, we do get import fruit and vegetables, and especially the soft fruit and vegetables from other countries that are affected, that is where we are putting ourselves at the most risk. But I've just come back from Europe in February, and this time around in Spain, and I saw all these black sticky traps. So these are for a new terrible, devastating pest called Tuta absoluta. So my question is, which pest will get here first? We need to be prepared for whichever one does. So thank you. That's for me.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Nicky. Really, really appreciate some of those shared lessons from your observations from how the global market is tracking. Just a couple of questions have come in for you, Nicky. One's come in about how, from your perspectives, how growers are managing using netting with second and third flushes of flowers for fruit production if the netting is in place.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question because, the way we are growing, especially with the blueberries, some of us are, trying to extend our period and trying to fruit for longer periods. Insect netting, you've either got to have, and this is a really difficult thing because we rely very heavily on honeybees and the native bees to pollinate. And so one of the things is blueberries, as everyone probably knows, are very, got very low protein content in their nectar, and the honeybees need to forage not only on blueberries but other things as well. So if you trap them inside your tunnels or your plastic, multi-span greenhouses, you need to provide something else for them to forage on as well as your blueberries. So whereas I think overseas they're a little bit more fortunate because they do have the access to bumblebees, and bumblebees can be contained a little bit more, and you can change and you have commercial hives that you have access to. But myself and my husband, we grow in a multi-span greenhouse. We have got our beehive placed in the wall so that half the hive can go in and half the hive can come in, and that way we can actually keep the hive health up, as well as get pollination in, as well as keep our crop inside the greenhouse protected. This doesn't always help for people who are in tunnels, but that's what we've had to do. It is a tricky situation where you're needing pollination and you're wanting to keep things like SWD out.
So, Nicky, you've preempted the next question that's come through from Tasmania. Questions come through with increase in protected cropping and berry production. Is SWD preparedness a good argument for allowing the use of bumblebees in Tasmania?
I do. I must say, listen, I'm a great advocate of honeybees, and I believe that, I would not like to put their livelihood at risk. But in my travels, I managed to go to Canada. They also treat the bumblebees as a pest, and what the government has allowed them to do is use bumblebees very well in greenhouses. Obviously, your greenhouses have to be insect screen protected. You are allowed to bring your bumblebees into your greenhouse. You're allowed to use them, and at the end of their 8-week cycle, you have to collect them back all in, at night they go back into their nesting, trap them all back in. You then take your bumblebees and put them into cold storage, put them to sleep, and then they get burnt. So there is very strict strict protocol on how they use their bumblebees so that they don't become a pest to the natural, you know, honeybees and natural bees and the environment. But I definitely see bumblebees for the protected cropping industry as absolutely necessary going forward. We find it hard enough to compete. And I definitely think that we, especially for products that need buzz pollination like blueberries, you know, bumblebees are absolutely necessary. Listen, I don't want to be naive. I know that we are working on using flies and other pollinators, but it would be nice to have access to bumblebees in a controlled manner.
Great, thanks for that, Nicky. If anyone else has any other questions they'd like to raise, feel free to type them in and we'll address it with the panel. Just while we're waiting for any of those outstanding questions, Bethan, maybe a question or some comments from yourself in regards to observations from potential SWD control for control of other pests that are currently present in Australia, such as Queensland fruit fly.
Yeah, so I obviously don't know as much about Q fly as the other people on the panel, but one of the things I did notice when we did the roadshow and the preparedness kickoff meeting last year was that, from my point of view, a lot of the control methods that we are using, a lot of the cultural and the hygiene control methods that we use to control SWD would help to control Q fly as well, especially the tight picking and the waste disposal and the fruit sterilisation, because again, that's reducing the chances of re-inoculation, not of just SWD, but Q fly as well, by removing those inoculated fruit. And obviously it is very labour intensive, but like Nicky said, the options are doing nothing and suffering almost 100% crop loss, or putting that extra time and money into increased hygiene practices. So yeah, I do think a lot of these methods can help with Q fly.
Great. Were there any other last outstanding comments or thoughts from the panel?
I'd just like to just quickly add as just that, you know, sometimes, you know, people are, you know, getting contraflow of products into their warehouses, and just to be really careful when you're going to markets where stuff is imported, and if you're picking up your trucks and, you know, you're picking up product and taking stuff back to neighbors or back to your, you know, your shops or whatever, just be really careful of your hygiene. And, you know, because it's when you least expect it, is from what I've, you know, I've seen where these incursions happen, is when, if you're not expecting to see a spotted wing Drosophila, and the next thing you have something unusual, you need to report it straight away to your DPI, and take action straight away, because, you know, your action, your immediate action could actually save your whole industry and your own farm.
Can I just add on that, on Nicky's point? We didn't have anything like that in the UK when SWD arrived, and it was almost nothing was done until it was a problem. So Nicky said about scrambling around once we are suffering crop losses. We only really got interested in this pest after 2014, where lots of growers lost over 50% of their crop to SWD. So I do think this project is already several steps ahead of where we were in the UK. And I think by containing outbreaks, if they do occur, I think that's going to be a far easier way of managing this pest than now doing what we're doing and scrambling around trying to catch up, and putting on curative methods as opposed to preventative methods.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks for those comments, Beth. And we're just drawing a close to the hour right now. So I might just want to thank all our speakers and panelists this evening. So particularly Jess, Bethan, James, and Nicky, but particularly all those who are able to join us for this important discussion. And it just goes to evidence, as Bethan said, we are on the front foot by having these discussions up front, and really appreciate everyone's attentive interest in this topic. We do hope you found the session informative, and please remember that a recording of this webinar will be made available on the Strawberry Innovation Project website. But otherwise, until next time, really appreciate your time again, and have a great evening. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.